This is really the next step in going beyond the basics of everything we've covered up to this point and focuses on what the craft of cinematic process is really about, creating an emotional experience for your intended audience. You might recall at the beginning of the quarter, we discussed the screen audience and the reader as being synonymous. In other words, the way that a script elicits emotion in the reader is the same way that a movie elicits emotion in the audience. But I mentioned that there's an exception to this approach. And here's the exception. It's in the way that you put the words on the page. Because in a film or a novel, TV show, documentary, whatever, there are countless things or elements that are either going to intensify the emotional experience of the audience or dissipate that emotion. In other words, all of the elements needed to produce a story, things like the direction, the performances of the actors and the actresses, the cinematography, editing, special effects, the art direction, sound editing, everything that everyone gets credit for in these works that are designed for the screen are either going to increase or decrease the emotional involvement of the audience. The experience of emotions is the most compelling reason that we go to the movies or watch TV, play video games, read books, attend plays, or go to even sporting events. And yet, emotional response is the subject, perhaps the one subject in storytelling that is too often overlooked. You have language, and you must use the most effective language at your disposal to elicit that same kind of emotional response in the reader that a movie is able to elicit from all these creative people working in harmony together to help achieve the same effect that they're after in telling that particular story. Therefore, your primary goal as a writer is the way you put the words on the page really is to create a vivid movie in the mind of the reader. And conversely, anything you do to slow the reader down, to call attention to the words on the page, or remind the reader in any way that he's reading a script, that's going to work against you. So the first thing to be concerned about as far as the script writing is concerned is the way you present your script with proper formatting. Keep in mind that it's absolutely critical to achieve proper screenplay format. The format we're shooting for in this initial stage is an industry standard, so you really need to practice it. It's most commonly referred to as a submission or proposal format. And what this means is that you must eliminate things like scene numbers, camera directions, parenthetical directions, sound effects placed all in capital letters, the word continued down at the bottom of the page. These things are basically known as shooting script devices. And any professional entity is going to recognize this as such, and they're going to question the professionalism of any given script. So we'll get to those other devices in Hume 341 prior to shooting our scenes. Right now, we want to keep some of those things out of the script. Next, the scene heading, or the slug line at the beginning of each scene, should identify only the location and the time of day. It should not include character names, it should not include descriptions, or it shouldn't say exterior, John and Mary walking through Central Park. That's the action. A proper slug line would read exterior, Central Park, day. And then the action would be John and Mary are taking a walk along the bridle path, etc. Next, it's important that you guys omit all references to the musical score or to the potential credit sequences out of your script. Even though you may have a clever idea of how the opening credits are shown, please omit them at this stage. Get right into the action of the story. And the same goes for music. It is not your job to decide what the background music should be, although some of you may have composed music that you intend to use. Even though you may have the perfect song or a perfect idea that captures how the lovers are going to just be shown growing in their affection during a romantic sequence, and you've got the perfect Barry Manilow song that you want to lay underneath the sequence, do not do it. That's a production and development meeting task for later. This is not your job at this stage. Just focus on the storytelling.
Got a friend in me. Score! You got a friend in me.
Next, begin and end the scene with action and description, not dialogue. And please never begin a scene with dialogue. The first thing we see should be that the wide margin paragraph that tells us or describes for us the setting in some way and tells us who is in the scene and describes the action if the characters are going to be doing anything. And finally, you're allowed only one setting per scene, and this is very important. The definition of a scene is action occurring in a specific time and place. That means anytime you change the setting within a scene, it requires a new scene slug line. So if your scene is occurring and then you pick up the conversation down in the parking lot, that's divided into a new scene when they're in the parking lot. You can't squeeze two locations for two different periods of time within the same scene. Okay, so that's all stuff for how you basically present the scene on the page. Now, as far as what happens in the scene with regard to the plot of the scene, the first thing you need to do is figure out what is the goal of your scene, or how does it connect to your hero's outer motivation. Again, the foundation of everything in your script is your story concept, which is your hero's visible desire. And every single scene in your script must somehow contribute to your hero's outer motivation. Either move your protagonist closer to it or create more obstacles to it. It's worth overemphasizing here that the critical component of all scene work is to make sure that each character within the scene has an objective. Remember, desire and conflict are at the heart of all storytelling, of all drama. Desire moves the story forward. Conflict gives it emotion. So every character in every scene must want something, or else there's no movement and the scene becomes static. But an equally important consideration is to then figure out how are these people, these individuals, character and goals in opposition to one another or some outer thing. Because remember, it is desire that moves the story forward, but it's the conflict that gives it emotion. So almost without exception, every scene in your story will likely have two or more characters in conflict. There will be occasional exceptions, such as when characters are working together to face something and overcome an obstacle together, or when they're falling in love, or if there's a moment of rest where they're getting along before the next obstacle is faced, and so on. But by and large, every scene in your story will have characters and conflict. So think about any scene in any movie that you've liked, that you vividly remember. And my guess is two characters wanted opposite things in that scene, and that's what made it memorable and emotional for you. Next, when you create a scene, you want to enter the scene as late as possible. And this is our classic Aristotle's in media res, coming in the midst of things. What that means is when you know what your goal is for that scene, you want to begin the scene as close as you possibly can to the moment where the main issue is going to be dealt with. We don't need to see a lot of preparation for that, a lot of particular movement toward the particular thing. Just come in as close as you can to that particular moment. Remember, these formats are called movies because they've got to move. So the first thing you want to ask beforehand, or anything after you figure out what the goal is what are the characters doing to get closer to their goal? Then think about what they're going to say. And always ask yourself in each scene, is this how these characters would normally behave? Is this believable? Is the audience going to buy this? But again, foreshadowing is a wonderful tool to make a character's behavior believable. You've planted important information earlier so that it's credible once it surfaces in your scene.